Donald Trump has made immigration the center of his campaign in some ways. He has talked about this kind of what would be a fairly radical program to try to bring about the deportation or self-deportation, to use the term from the Romney campaign, of as many as 11.3 million undocumented immigrants. Michael Chertoff, who was Secretary of Homeland Security under George W. Bush, who has been adamantly opposed to Trump's candidacy, told me, look, I reject everything that Trump is talking about, but I think we need to be clear here. He could do much of what he says. He could absolutely build a wall. It's not logistically impossible. It's a relatively modest expense. Some people say between $25 and $40 billion. What they would do is probably do a symbolic extension of what is an already existing federally financed fence along the border that was passed in 2006. It was passed with bipartisan support. I would actually point out that one of the senators who voted for it was Hillary Clinton. So you may get a fence that becomes bigger, more sort of robust, but that's going to happen in some form or another. The biggest concern, frankly, the thing that for me as an American, as a citizen, gives me real pause, and I think all of us should be aware of it, is that a president has enormous latitude to be able to begin a process of radical deportation, rounding people up. I spoke to Julie Myers-Wood, who headed ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, under George W. Bush. And she said it is a mistake to imagine that this stuff is campaign talk, that it's fantasy. All of the instruments are lying there for somebody who wants to do it. They could use, for instance, 287G of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which would allow them to enlist local and state agents, basically cops, in service of raiding farms, factories, boarding houses. They could, in fact, allow ICE officers to have access to IRS files so that they could find accurate home addresses, because a lot of undocumented immigrants file for taxes. They pay their taxes and they put their accurate addresses on there so that they can receive a refund, and they would be able to use those files in the event that a president allows it. Trump's overarching argument here, and we'll turn to questions in just a second, but I do think it's important to just mention a couple of last points here. Trump's overarching argument is economic, right? Trump says, elect me, and it worked. He said, elect me because I've had a successful career in business, and I will do for you what I've done for myself. And in the end, what is that actually boiling down to? When all the pieces have been sort of assembled and sort of finally became a platform, it ended up actually being a policy platform that is more recognizable than we might have imagined when it comes to tax policy. So he's talking about basically a supply-side plan. Steve Moore, as I mentioned, from Heritage, said to me, and Steve Moore basically wrote this up with Larry Kudlow, he said, quote, that's basically the theory here. The liberals say tax rates don't matter for stimulating growth. We say we do. That's the most important thing we're trying to do. And they want the tax cut to be their stimulus plan. They think that's the thing. If, in fact, the business cycle goes in the way that they expect, and they imagine there may be a downturn in the next year or two, they're expecting that a tax cut will provide the growth that they need to ride it out. The other piece of it is that Donald Trump has talked about trade pacts, and he believes it. He believes very much that these are, in fact, as he puts it, killing American jobs. He has the power to renounce the TPP. TPP's finished, I'm afraid. I think if anybody was interested in TPP, it's not going to happen. The question is whether he pulls out of NAFTA. I think he'll renegotiate NAFTA. He could pull out of the WTO entirely. He has that power. I'm going to leave you with just one comment here from one of his trade advisors. I think at the core of Trump's candidacy has been that he's going to surround himself with people who can do things at the top of the game, the best in the business. And I've spoken to his trade advisors, and this is not a partisan comment, but they're not the best in the business. And so at this point, I'm not sure who will actually be prosecuting this policy, who will be executing the policy. But if it's the people from the campaign, that's not going to be up to the standards that we would expect. Dan D'Amico, who is a good guy, he ran Nucor Steel for a long time, but he is basically one of Trump's principal trade advisors. And when I asked Dan, you'll have to forgive me here for an earthy quote, but when I asked Dan, what are you guys basically really going to do on China? Are you really going to be following through here on a trade war? He said, look, this is not, the goal here is that the bluff will be the thing. His belief is that if they go ahead, Trump's belief is that if he, with his persona, threatens trade tariffs, that's all they'll need to do. They think China will get on side, that they'll start to sort of change some of their behavior, and they won't actually get to a trade war. And Dan's analogy is, he said, the United States should be like an aggressive patient at a dentist's office. Quote, here's how the patient deals with the dentist. Sits down in the chair, grabs the dentist by the nuts and says, you don't hurt me, I won't hurt you, unquote. If you remember one thing from today, let it be that, I think. Look, I want to just, before we open it up to questions, say one thing. What can all of us do? I just can't bear to go out on a, I really think we'll all be crowded on the ledge taking turns, piling out the window. What can we do? What can we do? I think there are three things. There are actually three meaningful things that we can do, both to try to shape all of us. I mean this, frankly, I mean this as sort of Americans, but also Americans in positions. I know there are people here from other places, but all of us are in positions of, we have access to people who are going to be making decisions. When you find yourself at a dinner and you're asked to support a member of Congress, this is your opportunity to say, I have three things I want you to do, or I have one thing. And this is going to matter because right now, members of Congress, these are my neighbors now, they're struggling to figure out how to respond to somebody like Donald Trump. And there are, in fact, three real things we could do that would help the United States both ride out a Trump administration in a productive way, and then I think also blunt this really volatile political force that has been created over the course of the last generation. I call them retraining, rebalancing, and rebuilding. Retraining sort of speaks for itself. The simple fact is that globalization, as you know, has benefited some parts of the workforce to a much greater degree than others. The United States is failing when it comes to equipping and investing in our own workers to the degree that we have helped our companies become more globally competitive. If you compare the United States and Germany, the United States spends 1/8 as much as Germany does on worker retraining from trade-induced job dislocation. 1/8. Denmark spends 23 times what we spend. We're not going to be Denmark, but we could be something a lot better than where we are today. It's not a lot of jobs. It's not a lot of jobs. And the truth is that we could actually do it in a way that would begin to have a really profound effect. Overall, the G7 as a group spends 5 times as much on average that we do on retraining. There are a whole range of sort of what economists call active labor market measures that we can undertake. Number 2 is rebalancing. This is about education. We all of us, I think, sort of got into what Hillary Clinton called the educationalist philosophy over the last, and her husband, frankly, was the one who was probably most responsible for creating this idea, which was that a 4-year college degree, that was the goal, that was the mark of achievement. Same way that home ownership was a mark of achievement for a certain generation before 2008. But the simple fact is that a college degree today is both too expensive, a 4-year college degree is too expensive and not ultimately where the jobs are for a certain segment of Americans. Hillary Clinton, were she elected, was going to produce a very popular bill on both sides. This had been raved about in the National Review, and it was a big part of her agenda, and it was about apprenticeships. Very simple, $1,500 tax credit for any company that begins to take on apprentices. Expand the idea. We need something that's much more ambitious. Fareed Zakaria calls it something like a GI Bill, and I think he's absolutely right. We need to begin to shift the focus, shift the culture of education away from the prestige and the sort of the simple totem associated with a 4-year liberal arts college degree, and say we need to begin rewarding in status and in cultural capital the power of some mix of training and education, of on-the-job work and also education. If you have companies and you're in the position to be able to create those opportunities for people, it will pay dividends way beyond those companies. And lastly, the one thing I want to mention is rebuilding. I think if there is one piece on which Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton happen to agree, it's infrastructure. That is the one area, and Paul Ryan too. Paul Ryan's office before this election day was going around telling people in a kind of stage whisper around Washington to any reporter who would listen, we're ready to deal on infrastructure. We're ready to deal with Hillary Clinton on infrastructure. Well, now they're going to have Donald Trump. He says he wants to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. Infrastructure matters not because just the bridges and the roads need work. It matters because it increases your ability to get rehired. Because you can travel farther, you can commute to your job, you can work from home, your spouse can work from home, you can do all kinds of creative employment arrangements that prevent you from then later supporting a presidential candidate who may or may not be able to satisfy the things that you so desperately want. My point, folks, overall is very simple. Donald Trump is changing the nature of our relationship to globalization. He's changing it in a profound way. We don't really know where it's going to go. But it's not going to be defined in Brussels. It's not going to be defined in Beijing. The process of what globalization is going to look like for the next generation, I think, is going to be defined here at home and by all of us, by how we imagine, how it's going to reward others in our society, how it's going to reward us ourselves.